Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New Canaan Library. My name is Heather Cimino, and I coordinate adult programs here at the library. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Amanda Bellows to discuss her new nonfiction work called The Explorers. Amanda is a celebrated author, historian, and professor. Her new book, The Explorers, has been called a fascinating new history of America told through the stories of 10 extraordinary and often overlooked adventurers. Bellows brings history to life, inspiring readers to appreciate the courage and curiosity of those who shaped our world. So please put your hands together and welcome Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It is wonderful to be here with you all. I've heard so many great things about this beautiful library that you have, so it's really an honor to be here. I wanted to start by asking you all a question, which is, why do you think that some explorers from the past have been forgotten while others have been remembered? Okay, so how their stories maybe get told and circulated. Are they in newspapers? Great. Who their benefactors are. I think funding is a really interesting and important part of thinking about different types of expeditions. And maybe thinking about, do they write down their own stories? Are those stories published? Are they shared? Lots of interesting questions. So maybe we could think about that as we're talking about the lives of some of the people in this book. Why have some of them been remembered and why have some of them been forgotten? So tonight, I wanted to highlight 4 forgotten explorers. You're getting the Forgotten Explorers tonight from my new book. But first, I wanted to go back to the 19th century, mid-19th century. So in 1861, the German immigrant Emanuel Leutze painted what you see here. And on the bottom of the painting, you can see portraits of 2 men. And these were supposed to represent 2 of the nation's foremost explorers. And I wondered if anyone had any guesses who they were. One of them is Clark. Lewis was dead at this, well, I think they both might have been dead at this point, but so no, Lewis didn't make the cut here, but any other guesses on the other men? That's supposed to be Clark over there. It's Daniel Boone. Yes, Daniel Boone, yes. So before writing this book, if someone had asked me who America's most prominent explorers were, I too would have thought of Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Kit Carson. I might have heard that too. And I think many Americans think of kind of white men on the frontier in the 19th century as being a period and a time and a place where a lot of these explorers came from. But I wondered who else shared their drive to discover the unknown across the last 200 years. So I began researching that question, and I came across the stories of courageous men and women from diverse backgrounds, many of whom had been forgotten over time. And I learned more about why their names had been left out of history for so long. So my book, The Explorers, tells the stories of 10 adventurers, 4 men and 6 women, whose discoveries shaped the course of U.S. history. Each person's story represents a different era in American history. So the book begins with the Corps of Discovery's journey to the Pacific Ocean, told through the lens of Sacagawea, and then we move through the gold rush, the homesteading era, the birth of the conservation movement, the Gilded Age, the age of imperialism, the first 2 world wars, and the space race during the Cold War. So the book isn't just a collection of 10 biographies, it's also kind of a survey of U.S. history and these big discoveries, so through that lens of exploration. So it's from Sacagawea to Sally Ride. There are 2 parts to the book. The first part looks at 5 explorers looking within the bounds of the continental United States, and the second half of the book looks at explorers who've gone beyond the bounds of the United States. So we travel in the book to the Belgian Congo, throughout all of South America, to the North Pole, and then the last 2 chapters consider air and space as new frontiers. To begin researching this book, I took a road trip in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery, traveling from St. Louis, Missouri to Astoria, Oregon. I then went south to California and Nevada, visiting other sites related to some of the explorers in this book. So I just thought I would share a few of my favorite photos from the trip. A lot of them feature the Missouri River. You can probably guess why. This is Spirit Mound, South Dakota. That was a site that was important to indigenous people in South Dakota, also that Lewis and Clark visited. Here we are in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Has anyone been there? It's like one of the least visited parks, but there are lots of bison and it's not crowded, so highly recommend. This was an important site. I don't know, has anyone read the journals of Lewis and Clark, or maybe Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage? I see a hand in the back. Well, this is an important site in that book because it was where the Corps of Discovery united with Sacagawea's people, and her brother's name was Kamehameha, and so they had this moment where they, united after looking for each other. They were looking for the Shoshones. They traded horses. It was once not flooded. Today it is flooded, but it's amazing that you can go across America and see so many of the sites from that journey today that are still preserved. So this site was important to me. I reached my 50th state by crossing from Montana into Idaho at Lemhi Pass. This pass is situated in the Beaverhead Mountains of the Bitterroot Range, and it spans about 2 miles across the border of Montana and Idaho. Native Americans used it as a route for thousands of years, and then the Corps of Discovery passed through it in 1805. So back to the real explorers. I wanted to tell you about 4, I mentioned, men and women, and we're going to start with Jim Beckwourth, who you can see here. So he was born James Beckwith, becomes known as Jim Beckwourth, and he was a mountain man from the early 19th century. By show of hands, how many people have heard of Jim Beckwourth before? If you haven't heard this presentation before, yeah. Beckwourth was born into slavery in Frederick County, Virginia, to a white landowner and to an enslaved woman whose identity has been lost to history. So he was, under the laws of Virginia, legally considered to be a slave. He was raised by his father, who moved their family to St. Louis, Missouri around 1810. And St. Louis was then the gateway to the western frontier. Beckwourth had an extremely interesting life. He is going to travel all throughout the United States, live among different groups of people, brigades of mountain men with diverse backgrounds, members of the Crow Nation. I'll get into that in a little bit. So 1810, he arrives in Missouri, which again, I said was the gateway to the frontier. He gets a little bit of formal schooling there, and he also learns about the burgeoning fur trade. And that's around the time when his father legally emancipated him from slavery. So this was a time when global demand for pelts, like the top hat you can see here, made from beaver skins, fueled a rush among suppliers like John Jacob Astor, the members of the Chouteau family, and the trader Manuel Lisa. As a young man, Beckwourth wanted to travel to the western interior of the continent where he hoped to make a fortune. So we are lucky enough to have his autobiography, and he tells us about why he wanted to become an explorer. So he wrote the following: being possessed with a strong desire to see the celebrated Rocky Mountains and the great western wilderness so much talked about, I engaged in General Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company, quote. During the next 15 years, Beckwourth traveled throughout the Rocky Mountains and traded on behalf of the American Fur Company. He lived among the Crow people. He said he became a chief. He married at least 7 indigenous women, all of whom he later abandoned. Traveled to the southwest along the Santa Fe Trail, ended up in California right at the start of the gold rush. So this was in May of 1849. Thousands of people are flocking to California. And Beckwourth happens to see this boat, and he hops on this boat because he's in California. So he gets on in Monterey, he arrives in San Francisco, and he immediately heads to the motherlode country in one of the first groups of people. He was really an entrepreneurial person who was always, looking for action and always being in the right place at the right time. Now he sees all these prospectors going to make their money, or hoping to make their money, but instead of mining for gold, he first starts out by buying goods and then selling the goods to miners at inflated prices. And then he goes off and prospects for gold, so he makes a little money first. In 1850, Beckwourth was searching for gold in California's American Valley. But as he and a group of other prospectors climbed over the steep hills, he was surprised to find not gold, but a hidden path through a treacherous mountain range. And he predicted that this pass would, quote, afford the best wagon road through the American Valley, approaching from the eastward, a route that would significantly accelerate emigration through the region and increase its prosperity. So in his mind, this discovery of a potential pass was as good as gold. So what does he do? He raises money from the people of the town where the pass would be ending. He hires people, he builds a road. He almost dies, actually, during the construction of the road from a bacterial infection. He survives, and then he diverts travel to that road and leads the first group of wagons over the pass. That pass became known as Beckworth's Pass, and at 5,221 feet, it was the lowest route through the Sierra Nevada mountains in its day. Has anyone by chance been to Beckworth's Pass? Okay, well, you can, go and see the marker that is, commemorating his discovery. So at the end of his life, he lives near the pass in California. He runs an inn and welcomes, immigrants into the pass, and then he also publishes his autobiography. He died back in Colorado in 1866 among the Crow people. Multiple newspapers reported his passing, with one writing, quote, "There are few men in the world who have passed through a more exciting or eventful history than he, and there are but few men who have a bigger heart than he." So why do you think it is that people today, most people, have either never heard of Beckworth or, that his name has been forgotten? I mean, I think his race plays a big part of it. There were so many white frontiersmen from that period, many of whom we named, and I think they do a lot of self-promotion and get so much attention that his story, although he does, write an important autobiography, it sort of got forgotten over time. But this was an important discovery that he made, and it really did shape California history. All right, so the next explorer I'd like to talk about is Florence Marion Bailey. Has anyone heard of Florence before? So she was born in Locust Grove, New York in 1863 near the Adirondack Mountains, and she's basically, growing up in the Gilded Age in the mid to late 19th century. Now, this was a period when women's fashion dictated the use of feathers in hats and dresses. And these trends came not only from urban Americans' growing interest in recreational activities, including hiking, hunting, and fishing, but also from the cultural influence of realism and naturalism in art and literature. So this parade still takes place today in New York. It's a little bit different, but you can see, right, the Gilded Age elite, you can see so many feathers in their hats at the turn of the 20th century. This was a hat owned and worn by Mrs. Henry Clay Frick in the 1890s. You can see it has crow feathers, and I think, yes, but you can see the face of the crow and the beak. Yes, so that was fashionable at the time. And then here is a satirical magazine, Puck magazine. So I think this is an interesting one to show because it talks about the demand, whose consumption desires are leading to that, leading hunters to kill birds en masse. So demand for dead birds rises dramatically in the 1870s and 1880s. Scholars estimated that by the mid-1880s, hunters slaughtered 5 million birds annually and sold them primarily to hat makers, dressmakers, and their customers, predominantly women. So this is showing that women, although they're not physically behind the gun out there hunting, right, their demand in fashion is a big contributing factor. But popular awareness of the crisis was pretty limited during that period. One person who helped draw attention to that was a man named Frank Chapman. He was an ornithologist. He went down to Union Square, stood at 14th Street in 1886, and with his notebook in hand, he counted all the different birds on the heads of women over the course of 2 afternoons. Observed robins, bluebirds, grouse, and woodpeckers. I think there were 40 different species that he counted. So what were people going to do? People like Chapman and others who cared about this crisis. So Florence Merriam, I'm going to call her Merriam because most of the action takes place before she's married, matriculated at Smith College in 1882. And that's where she became, really interested in becoming an ornithologist, an amateur ornithologist. So she founds a local Audubon club at Smith College. Any Smith grads here? And she teaches Smith's 300 undergraduate women about birds and why they should be preserved instead of killed in the name of fashion. The club's first meeting was so successful that the city milliner inquired anxiously afterward, I'm quoting here, a city milliner inquired anxiously if the college authorities had forbidden the use of birds since so many hats had been brought to her to be retrimmed. So she really made it like a local impact at Smith, but of course, I think she wanted to do much more nationally. So she made it her life's mission to save birds through exploration. You can see her right at a campsite in New Mexico in 1901. Her strategy was unique. She traveled to different regions of the United States to observe birds, record her findings, and then write about them for a popular audience rather than a specialist audience. She wanted to change people's attitudes about the value of birds' lives by stressing the anthropomorphic characteristics of birds, their habits, preferences, and relationships. So she travels to California and Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and becomes a leading conservationist. And I think this is a point in history where we see the goals of exploration change from the acquisition of land, kind of in the exploitation of resources like we did see in Jim Beckworth's lifetime, and now we see preservation and conservation as goals. She was also a friend of John Muir's, who's another explorer featured in the book, so you can see those changes happening. And then the last thing she did was she did some political lobbying, so she helped pass the Lacey Act, which harnessed the power of the federal government to preserve birds on a national scale for the first time. That was in 1900. So it penalized those who sought to illegally acquire, transport, or sell protected wildlife. Why do you think we haven't heard of Florence Bailey? Yes, I mean, I think that Miriam grew up she grew up earlier than Carson and was active in an earlier period when women's voices, I don't think, were valued as much in society. But she did a lot to break those barriers. She was the first female associate member of the American Ornithologists Union. So being involved in that group, which did a lot of political activism, those were groundbreaking actions for women to do at the time. Right, so 2 more explorers. I don't have a clock, so would someone mind telling me the time? Thanks. 7:20. Great. All right, so this is Harriet Chalmers Adams. She was an explorer and geographer from the turn of the 20th century. She grew up in Stockton, California in 1875, had a very active childhood swimming and horseback riding, but she was really intrigued by California's diversity and colonization by Spain, and her interest in Spanish culture would shape her future travels. In 1899, she married a man who became a surveyor of mines in Central and South America, and that gave them both the opportunity for extensive travel. This was during a time when, after the Spanish-American War of 1898, U.S. companies sought access to Latin American mines because of industrialization. So as the number of American factories producing mass-market goods exploded, manufacturers sought raw materials, including heavy metals, to support production. So the chapter about Harriet in the book focuses on a 2-year trip that she took between 1904 and 1906 to every single country in South America, which is very impressive. I'll just tell you some of the highlights from that trip. She went to La Paz in Bolivia, and in La Paz, she focuses a lot on Bolivia's indigenous Aymara people. They were colonized in the mid-16th century by Spanish settlers looking for silver. So Harriet, she ends up writing about them for National Geographic magazine. She takes photographs of them. In fact, I have here some pictures I've been meaning to show you. The Aymara suffered via a system called repartimiento, which was this source of oppression and fraud, Harriet said, relating to their obligation to pay exorbitant prices for Spanish articles utterly useless to them. They also were forced to labor in mines and plantation and died by the thousands from overexertion and ill treatment. So Adams laments their historical oppression and is careful, in my opinion, to take respectful photographs that are trying to capture their way of life. She also often, I think, in a way that other explorers before her didn't do, she's recognizing some of the negative consequences of exploration and the settlement that can follow exploration, that often follows exploration, in a way that folks like Beckworth and other frontiersmen did not. Adams also journeyed near Incan ruins in the Andes Mountains, and she spent a good deal of time in the wilderness there, encountering wildlife, attacks by vampire bats, and much more. And one of her greatest accomplishments was her ascent of the volcano pictured here called El Misti, which is dormant, but it's 19,200 feet in elevation. And by scaling that mountain, she reached an elevation that was just 2,000 feet lower than the record set by any climber in the first decade of the 20th century. And that included all men. So she was, it almost killed her. She spoke about the strain on her heart. She was really sick afterward, but she was tough as nails. She didn't faze her. So after returning from abroad, she, as I mentioned, began working for National Geographic magazine. She was unfortunately excluded from countless explorers clubs that provided financial support and comradeship for men. So she decided to found her own club, which was the Society of Women Geographers. Has anyone heard of that? It's in Washington, D.C., still a very active organization today. In fact, its 100th anniversary is next year. And they gave their first medal to one of the other explorers featured in the book, Amelia Earhart, for her solo transatlantic flight. Why do we think that Adams wasn't remembered? Well, for starters, she never published anything autobiographical. In fact, the only way that I was able to tell her story in the book was because another scholar was kind enough to give me the unpublished journal transcriptions that she made decades ago. So I think sources are a really big part of the story. What do we have access to, and how does that enable us, right, to tell people's stories? The last explorer I'd like to talk about today is my favorite explorer in the book, and that is Matthew Henson. Has anyone heard of Matthew Henson before? Great, you're going to love his story. So he was born in Maryland in 1866 to sharecroppers just 1 year after the Civil War ended. He had a really hard upbringing. His parents died when he was only 7, so he was orphaned. He moved to Washington, D.C., where an uncle lived, but he wasn't happy there, and he ran away to Baltimore to become a cabin boy at the age of 11. So he becomes a cabin boy on a merchant vessel bound for Hong Kong, and he recalled that he took naturally to a life of travel. Here's what he said. After my first voyage, I became an able-bodied seaman, and for 4 years followed the sea in that capacity, sailing to China, Japan, Manila, North Africa, Spain, France, and through the Black Sea to southern Russia. Quote. So he had, a lifetime's worth of experiences before he turned 18. And I would argue that these trips prepared him for what would be his greatest role as an explorer, which was his journeys to the inhospitable Arctic with Robert Peary, who was a Navy officer and leader, ultimately, of their expedition to the North Pole. So Henson was 19 years old when he first teamed up with Robert Peary. Have people heard of Robert Peary before? Yes. Yep. So first he served as his aide, and the two of them completed, I believe it was 7 expeditions in total to the Arctic, each time trying to push further and further north. And this was a time when an imperialist impulse swept across many Western nations. This is the early 1900s. The North Pole represented an elusive prize that would bring not only fame, but also triumph to an explorer's country of origin. While they were exploring, Henson became hardened by the frigid climate and adopted new ways of living. The members of the Inuit community, an indigenous group of people who had lived in the Arctic at that point for hundreds of years, they taught Henson how to endure extreme weather, how to hunt and forage for food in a land of scarce resources. Henson, unlike Peary, became fluent in the Inuit language and learned how to expertly build and craft, to build and use sleds. So the pinnacle of Henson's exploratory journey was his journey to the North Pole from 1908 to 1909. And I tell you about all of these, skills that he had because you'll hear that newspapers and other reporters, right, discounted his role on all of these expeditions. And so he was really an exceptionally talented person, but that part of his story was lost for many decades. So their journey to the North Pole, this is when Peary and Henson and their supporting team, they're trying to actually get to the North Pole, and it's a long journey. So July 1908, their ship called the SS Roosevelt, named after Teddy, who was president at the time, leaves from New York City. 2 months later, you can see they get all the way up to Cape Sheridan at the top of the image here. And that's a barren region located in the northeastern corner of Canada's Ellesmere Island. There, they would spend the winter before embarking on their final push to the North Pole. So in February of 1909, they traveled to Cape Columbia. You can see that on the map too. That's about 93 miles north of Cape Sheridan. From there, they traveled 413 nautical miles to reach the North Pole. I'm glossing over the hardships of that journey. You'll enjoy the chapter in the book about that. It took about a month of travel. It was a grueling period when Henson said his mind was on the going and getting forward and on nothing else. Henson almost drowned. One of the 4 Inuit men who was with them had to pull him out. Peary almost drowned seconds later. I mean, they're traveling over sea, and they don't have enough food. It's bitterly cold. I mean, it was the most strenuous thing you could imagine, really. But they did ultimately, here's some these are real photographs. And this is a real picture of them at the North Pole. And so, people have, of course, over time tried to figure out exactly how close did they get. And I believe National Geographic's assessment concluded that they got as close as they could, within a couple miles using the instruments of the day. So to me, that's good enough. So they planted the flag. You can see Henson's in the middle there. And Henson wrote that he, quote, felt a thrill of patriotism. And he said, I raised my voice to cheer the starry emblem of my native land. With his team, he's rejoicing in what he views as the discovery of what he called almost the last of the world's great work, taking his place in history as the first Black explorer to stand at the top of the world. But as an African American returning to the United States during what was now the Jim Crow era, he did not receive his due for the critical role he played in the expedition. At home, newspapers predominantly targeting white audiences overlooked or minimized his contributions. So for instance, I found some papers that referred to him by the wrong name. They called him things like Dave the Cook, not acknowledging, his fluency in the Inuit language, his ability to craft the sleds. And in fact, in an interview done, I think it was in maybe the 1930s, Henson even said that he was the first person to actually get to the point 45 minutes ahead of Peary. And then Peary took out the instruments and did the measurements and things. So this is, Peary and Henson disputed this afterwards, but it's possible that Henson was actually the first person to reach the North Pole. So but Black newspapers targeting, with Black readerships, by contrast, are celebrating Henson's success and enumerating the ways in which he helped the expedition's members reach the North Pole. Only in his later life did he receive fuller recognition for his achievements. The Explorers Club allowed him to join in 1937. Congress gave him a Peary Polar Expedition Medal in 1944. And he died in New York City in 1955 and was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. However, under the Reagan administration, his remains were reinterred with honors in Arlington National Cemetery. And if you go there today, you can see the dueling narratives, even in death, about that journey to the North Pole, because Peary has this, white, I'm not sure of the material, monument to himself, a big globe, and talking about reaching the North Pole. And then Henson has a monument in Blackstone with a visual depiction of his accomplishments and his journey to the North Pole. So it's worth seeing in a visit to Arlington Cemetery sometime. So this concludes the presentation for tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions about these explorers, other individuals in the book, traits that you need to succeed as an explorer, goals of exploration, anything that you like. So thank you so much.